When I was growing up, we had this book called Tiki Tiki Tembo, and it's this awesome book, and it's this awesome story, and we totally grew up on it. And I remember this amazing experience of my older brother Clayton reading this story to me as fast as it could, because it's a story about this Chinese kid with a really, really long name, and the idea is that you have to say his name many times throughout the story. That's kind of the fun of it. When I'm driving in the car with my daughters, we often like to turn on Stories podcast. It is by Amanda Weldon. It's this really awesome podcast. You can get it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and she shares stories for kids, and they're these like 10-minute little short stories that are really quite charming. And we were listening to one, and she shares a story that is also about a presumably, whether it's Chinese, Japanese inspired. I believe that Amanda Weldon sort of helped make this story up, but it's about this kid named Jugamu, who also has a really long name. And actually the narrative is the spitting image. It is the spitting image of Tiki Tiki Tembo. And so I'm listening to it, and I'm like wrinkling up my nose as Amanda Weldon and Scott Iseri are sharing this story, and I'll get into a little more of the details here in a second, but they're sharing this story, and I'm wrinkling my nose because I'm like, that's not Tiki Tiki Tembo. That's not how the story goes. I know the story, and suddenly I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm doing it again, where there's not room in this world for multiple versions of a narrative, and yet at its core, the original narrative form is ever-changing. Tiki Tiki Tembo no Sorembo, Cherry Berry Ruchi Pip Peri Pembo. And it's a story about Tiki Tiki Tembo, and he ends up falling in a well, and his older brother has to run for help. And when he has to run for help, he gets to his parents, and he's trying to tell them what happened. He's tripping over himself, and he's having the hardest time because he's got to keep repeating this name. And every time he repeats the name, Tiki Tiki Tembo no Sorembo, Cherry Berry Ruchi Pip Peri Pembo, it slows him down, and he's not able to get the message out because the name is so long. But eventually he goes and gets a man who has a ladder, and he tells him to. He's like, Tiki Tiki Tembo no Sorembo, Cherry Berry Ruchi Pip Pip Peri Pembo has fallen in the well. And the guy's like, who? And he has to say it again, Tiki Tiki. And eventually they get a ladder, and they go rescue his brother. And from this story, the parents decide that naming their son Tiki Tiki Tembo no Sorembo, Cherry Berry Ruchi Pip Peri Pembo is just too long of a name, and they shorten his name to just Tiki. And I did a little bit of reading, and I guess this story was inspired by some folklore in China that is seeking to explain why names in Chinese are so short. And this myth that inspired this children's book is where that comes from. Like I said, on the Stories podcast, they share a similar narrative, and Amanda Weldon invites Scott Iseri to come on and share a story, and together they tell this story of Jugamu, Shibuya K Bjorn, Lucky Endeavor, Clever Forever, Boogie Shu Do Tashi Maste Popcorn. And that's the name of this kid in the story. And throughout the entire podcast, they have to say the name over and over and over. And we derive a lot of the humor from repeating this name over and over. And it's the same story. Jugamu, Shibuya K Bjorn, Lucky Endeavor, Clever Forever, Boogie Shu Do Tashi Maste Popcorn ends up falling in a hole. And it's just like falling in the well in the Tiki Tiki Tembo story. And his friend has to go for help. But there's a twist that they do in the Stories podcast version of Tiki Tiki Tembo. And I guess this is a new version of the story. It's Jugamu. And the difference is, instead of the message being, gosh dang it, Jugamu, you've got too long of a name, we need to shorten it, they actually put a twist on it. And the way they tell the story is that because his friend never learned his full name, when she goes to get help, she's not able to get help because they don't know who she's talking about. Because she doesn't know his name, she called him Jugi. So the message in this more modern version, in my opinion, of Tiki Tiki Tembo, the message is that instead of shortening names because of cultural or, modern expediency, we should learn people's names how it is. And at first this bothered me because I was like, come on, Tiki Tiki Tembo, that's not what the story's about. Like, of course, having your name be Jugamu, Shibuya K Bjorn, Lucky Endeavor, Clever Forever, Boogie Sho Do Tashi Maste Popcorn, like, that's just ridiculous. You can't have your name that long. But as I've thought more about it, I had a couple friends at college who came over. They were from China, and they came over to study in America, and they were in school with me. And when they'd come over, they would pick an American name to make it easier on people who wouldn't know how to pronounce their name. And I thought that was interesting. And more than interesting, I thought that must have been difficult to feel like you have to sacrifice a certain part of who you are. And, names are part of our legacy. A name is the one thing that gets passed on to us from our parents, and names have meaning. And after thinking about these different versions of the same story that are told with two very, very different messages in the end, I like both of them. And the version with Jugamu Jugamu, I just thought it was super interesting that it's sort of this message that instead of making someone change their name because modern culture doesn't like the having to repeat it so long, it's like, no, you should learn how to say someone's name the right way. And I think there is some truth there. I actually think there's truth in both of the narratives, and they're both worth hearing the stories and understanding them and thinking about them. And of course, this is just a little kid's book and a kid's story, but shifting just a few of the details totally changes the entire meaning of the story. So to round out today's episode, I'm going to try something. And in the beginning of Neil Gaiman's book on Norse mythology, he makes an invitation that I took to heart, and I've been nervous to do this, because Neil Gaiman is his voice, his cadence, and then his writing is just so good in Norse mythology. I recommend everyone to go read it. It's so engaging and interesting to hear these stories about Thor and Loki and Odin. He makes this invitation that I wanted to share with all of you.
I hope I've retold these stories honestly, but there was still joy and creation in the telling. That's the joy of myths. The fun comes in telling them yourself, something I warmly encourage you to do, you person listening to this. Read the stories in this book, then make them your own. And on some dark and icy winter's evening, or on a summer night when the sun will not set, tell your friends what happened when Thor's hammer was stolen, or how Odin obtained the mead of poetry for the gods. Neil Gaiman, Listen Grove, London, May 2016.
Okay, so this invitation was really interesting for me because I was thinking about oral narrative and my podcast and YouTube and the content that I'm sharing and being a writer, and I just felt very compelled to try this on. When Neil invites everybody to listen to these stories and then to share them. Imagine yourself gathered around a campfire at night and sharing these stories. He says, make them your own. Tell them, don't be so worried about getting them right or wrong, but share the stories so that they can live on in their form that they were originally created in. And I took that to heart and I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to find an opportunity to share a story from Norse mythology. And I just want to say, like I said, I'm a little nervous here because I'm not a scholar in Norse mythology. I haven't read tons and tons and tons of Norse mythology. I'm just a fan who really enjoyed hearing Neil Gaiman share these stories, and I wanted to participate and I wanted to pass along one of those stories. So without further ado, I am going to share the story of the Master Builder, or the Wall of Asgard. And again, if there are any mistakes or I get anything wrong, I'm sorry. And I guess I should also mention that I gave myself a few stipulations or a few rules when it came to preparing to tell this story. And that was, I wanted it to be an experience as an oral narrative passed from one person to another. And so at first I started writing down details so that I could remember names, I could remember order. And I was like, no, it's not allowed. I'm going to listen to the story 2 times and I'm going to turn around and share it. And I'm sorry if I get anything wrong, but for me, it felt important to me to experience this way of oral narrative and to take in a story and to pass it on. And so this was my favorite story in the whole book, and I'd like to pass it on. The Master Builder, or the Wall of Asgard. So as it goes, there was a time when Thor headed to the east, and he went there to fight the trolls. And Thor was one of the chief protectors of Asgard, the home of all of the gods. And while he was gone, the gods got to thinking, and even though they weren't really worried about a war right now, this was during a time that the Aesir and the Vanir were actually allies, and so they weren't worried about a war. But Odin was thinking still, and he thought, we can't always rely on Thor to protect us. We need a way to protect Asgard if and when Thor is away like he is now. Well, as Odin's thinking about this and discussing this with the other gods, one day a stranger comes to Asgard. A stranger comes with a big black stallion with him, and he says hello. He's dressed up as a smith, and he tells them that he is a master builder, and that he understands that the gods are looking for someone to build a wall around Asgard. And Odin says, yes, we are looking for someone to do that. Is that something you could do? And this master builder tells them that he is an expert builder and that he could do this, but the price is very, very high. And Odin says, name your price. And he says, well, first, I want the hand of Freya. And Freya is one of the most beautiful of the Aesir. She's one of the most beautiful of all the gods. And he wants to take her hand in marriage. And when the other gods looked to Freya, as the master builder mentions taking her hand in marriage, she had no reaction except that her lips seemed to be very pursed, and she was very clearly not happy with the direction this conversation was going. But that wasn't all. The master builder also said that he wanted them to give him the sun as well as the moon. Now, it was a steep price, and Loki stepped in and said, that it is a very steep price that you are asking to build this wall. How do we know that you can achieve building this wall? And he says, I can build a wall so strong that no troll could break through it. I can build a wall that's so tall that no giant can climb over it. I can build a wall that the rocks fit so perfectly together that not an ant could crawl between the pieces of stone. And it will certainly protect Asgard. And Loki said, that sounds really, really good. But a wall like that must take a really long time to build. And this stranger, he laughed and said, no, it won't take long. I can do it in 3 seasons. It is the beginning of winter now, and give me a winter, a summer, and another winter, and I can have your wall complete. The gods thought in this, and Odin sat back and was like, this is interesting. And Freya, she looked downright disgruntled that they would even be considering this option. But the gods convened, and the stranger went away, and they went inside the halls of Valhalla, and Odin questioned the gods. He said, this is a steep price, but it would be great to have a wall. Do we believe that he can do it? And the god said, it is too high a price to pay. We do not want to lose Freya, much less the sun and the moon. It is too high a price to pay. And so Odin said, well, then it is decided. We will not have him build our wall. Somebody coughed, though, in one corner. And it was the kind of cough that drew attention to itself. And everybody turned and looked at Loki. He was sitting in a corner. And as they were looking at him, he says, I don't think that you guys have thought this through very much. And Odin said, oh, really? You don't think we've thought this through? Why is that, Loki? And he said, because it will take a long time to build this wall. And I don't think that this stranger can do it. And Odin says, well, if he can't do it, then why are we bother dickering with him even in the first place? Why are we even discussing it? And Loki said, I think you're missing a key point. We need to agree with him that we will pay him all that he asks if he finishes building the wall in the amount of time that we put forth. And everybody said, if? And he said, if. And if he cannot complete the wall, well, then we don't have to pay him anything. And Odin says, but why would we want to do that? And Loki's like, are you really so thick? If he completes most of the wall, then we'll have most of the work done. And he passes the deadline. We'll get our wall almost entirely finished, and we'll get it all for free. And then once he has left, we can finish building the wall ourselves, and we can have our cake and eat it too. At this point, many of the gods were nodding and slapping Loki on the back and saying, you are a very clever fellow. And Odin asked Loki, do you really think he'll agree to this? And Loki says, well, if he doesn't, then nothing's changed. But it's worth asking, don't you think? And all the gods were very excited at this point. Except for one god. Freya looked at Loki, and she said, I hate you. I think you are foolish because you think you are so clever. And she stormed away. Nevertheless, the gods proceeded outside. They called this stranger, and Loki spoke for them and said, we're interested in having you build our wall, and we can agree to the things that you have requested for this wall, but we want you to do it in 1 season. It is the first day of winter now, and if you aren't able to finish the wall by the first day of summer, then the deal is off. Second, you can have no help. We don't want you going and rounding up a bunch of your friends because we're only paying you, and the agreement was that you would complete the wall. Are we in agreement? Well, the stranger looked around, and he looked back at his horse, and he said, one condition, can I have my horse help me? And everybody thought about it, and all the gods nodded and said, a horse is a very useful thing when building a wall. So they agreed, and they said, you can use your horse, but nobody else to help you build this wall. And you must have it done by the first day of summer. The stranger agreed. He said he could do it. So the gods made oaths. They got together and made the kind of oaths that could not be broken. They swore on Draupnir, Odin's armband, and they swore on Gungnir, Odin's spear. And they swore that they would hold up this oath, that if a wall was built for them by the first day of summer, using no help from anyone except the stranger's horse, then they would pay him with the gift of the sun and the moon and the hand of Freya in marriage. Well, the oaths having been made, the stranger set to work. First, he dug a great trench, and he did it quickly. In the matter of a few days, he dug a great trench all around Asgard that was extremely deep. And the gods watched him, and they were impressed. This man is moving very, very quickly. Psh, Loki brushed it off and said, anybody can dig a hole. He's just digging a hole. Just you wait. Once he has to fetch rocks from the mountains, you will see. It will take him more than one season to be able to complete this wall. That evening, they saw the stranger leave. He took his horse, Swathelfili, and they headed towards the mountain. And this horse was very, very strong. And to it, he attached a great sled. And they headed for the mountains. And Loki said, they'll be gone for forever. It will take weeks to fill the sled with stone to build this wall. And everybody trusted Loki. But the next morning, they were surprised to see the stranger coming back. And Swathelfili had behind him a great mount of stones in the sled that the horse was pulling to the spot where the ditch had been dug to build the wall. And the master builder set to work, taking great stones and planting them in the ground and filling up the trench and stacking one stone on top of another. And all the gods watched, and all of them began to get a little bit nervous. None so much as Freya, who did not hate the stranger, but instead turned all her hatred and her malice towards Loki. And she refused to even say a word to him, but stormed off. Loki dismissed it and said, please, the winter has only just begun. He's only got started. There's so much work to do. Anybody can get a good start on a project, but as time goes, this stranger will get tired and he'll start moving slower. There is no way he can finish this wall by the first day of summer. And Odin said, Loki, for your sake, I hope you are right. But as the days transpired, each evening the stranger would head off to the mountains with his horse, and he would come back the next morning with a sled full of enormous stones to be stacked and to build the wall. The days came, the days went, and as winter was fading and the snow began to melt, the paths became covered in mud and water. And Loki said to the gods as they watched the stranger work, now you'll see. Nobody can pull a sled in this mud. Surely he's going to slow down. The progress is not going to continue. But like clockwork, the stranger would leave and come back in the morning with just as much stones. The mud didn't seem to slow him down at all. And all of the gods began to get very, very nervous as that first day of summer was approaching. And it did look like the stranger was going to complete the wall in time. Well, a few nights before the stranger was to finish the wall, the gods gathered, and they needed to discuss what was happening, because they had to find a solution, and everyone was upset, Freya more than the rest, and they urged Odin, you must do something about this. So they called in, and Odin says, we must find a solution, but we have sworn unbreakable vows that we would adhere to the rules of the agreement. Odin said, we must find a way to not pay this stranger without breaking our agreements. And Loki shrugged it off and said, bah, the wall is worth it. If we give up the sun and we give up the moon, who really cares? I mean, we got our wall, we got what we wanted. Everybody turned and gazed and glared at Loki, but none more so than Freya. And she said to him, if this stranger finishes the wall in time and I am to be given to him in marriage, Father Odin, I would ask that you do one thing for me, and that is that you would kill Loki before I am taken off to live with this stranger, that I might see the one who caused this terrible thing to happen to me put to death. Odin agreed, and he looked to Loki and said, if you do not find a solution, your death will be slow and painful. So Loki sat and thought, and he decided, you know what, there is something that we can do about this. Fine, I will solve this problem myself. And Loki left without telling any of the other gods what he was up to. Well, the next day, when the stranger was getting ready, when he hitched up his sled to Swathelfari and was getting ready to head to the mountains, he looked around and he was like, where is my steed? Where has Swathelfari gone? And he looks up the hill and he whistled for Swathilfari, and Swathilfari didn't come running like normal. So the stranger trudged up into the forest, and he hiked and looked around, and eventually he laid eyes on Swathilfari at a distance. But something was distracting Swathilfari. He called to the horse, and the horse came running back a distance, but as he approached, the stranger heard 2 sets of hooves, not just one. And as Swathilfari drew nearer, he saw the horse was accompanied by a mare, a beautiful, beautiful chestnut brown mare that you didn't even have to check to know that it was indeed a female, because everything about it just spoke of pure, beautiful horse femininity. And Swathilfari seemed to be very interested in this mare. In fact, the mare would nicker and chew at the grass and wait there, and Swathilfari would go running up to meet the mare, but every time he came within a few yards of this new horse, the mare would take off running, and Swathilfari chasing after it. Up and into the hills, and the stranger whistled and called for Swathilfari to join him, and the horse would not come back. He just continued to chase this new, beautiful mare into the mountains. Well, there was only a day left before the stranger had to complete the wall, and so he grudgingly grabbed his sled, and he charged up to the mountains to get the stones by himself. After a long, hard night, he returned to Asgard. His sled had 10 stones in it. Freya was there waiting, and as he pulled up with the stones and no sign of the horse anywhere, Freya said, "You have only brought back 10 stones. You will need double, if not triple that, in order to complete the wall. How are you going to do it?" The gods gathered to hear the stranger's answer, and at this point, the stranger threw up his arm and said, "You cheated me! You tricked me! I could have finished the wall by the day that was determined, but you found a way to take my horse so that I would not have Swathilfari in order to help me get the stones." To which Odin said, "We did not cheat you. You cheated us. Because you are no smith. You are a stranger in disguise, and I know you. You are none but a frost giant." To this the stranger screamed and shed his clothes and his cloak, and suddenly he grew 4 times in size and became standing there before them a massive giant. And he said, "Yes, I am a giant, and you have done me wrong, and you agreed to give me the sun, the moon, and Freya. And since you double-crossed me, I intend to have my gifts." And as he reached down to take Freya, there was a sharp noise on the hillside. Everybody turned to look, and lo and behold, who was coming down from the mountain toward Asgard but Thor himself. He was gleaming and strong and carrying his massive hammer Mjolnir, and he was ready and excited. He thought it was nice of the gods to have prepared some entertainment for his homecoming. Thor came running up, and without hesitation, at seeing a frost giant there in Asgard, he swung his hammer around and threw it as hard as he could at the giant. The hammer went flying directly towards the giant and clocked him square in the head, killing him in an instant. The gods looked around. They thanked Thor, especially Freya, for saving her from the clutches of this frost giant. But they all looked around and said, "Well, we have most of our wall. Loki was right. We have most of our wall, and we did not have to pay with the sun and the moon and with the hand of Freya. I guess we should probably finish this wall." And when they looked around to congratulate themselves and said, "Where's Loki? We want to tell him he was right. His cleverness was right." But Loki was nowhere to be found. Months later, after the gods had finished building the wall that the giant had started, Loki showed up, and with him was a small gray foal. But there was something interesting about this foal. It had 8 legs instead of 4, and it was one of the strongest foals ever. And they named it Sleipnir, and it became the horse of the gods. It was given to Odin as a gift for him to ride as his own steed. But as it grew up, everyone noticed that it showed a certain natural fondness towards Loki. In fact, when it was able, it followed him around as if Loki was his mother, which, in truth, Loki was. Although you wouldn't have mentioned it directly to his face because Loki never would have admitted it. And anyone that did bring it up did not live to see very many more days. And that is the story of how the gods got their wall around Asgard.